My name is Barbara Hawkes from Acas. I'm a senior advisor. I'm here at the Fit for Work London Roadshow talking about managing absence and managing presence within the workplace.
Good morning, everybody. Brave introduction. My name is Barbara Hawkes from Acas, and I'm sure I get the impression there's quite a few HR people here. So I understand that some of you may have had contact with our conciliation services in the past. Hopefully a lot of you will have had contact with our helpline to help prevent those problems, and also our website. Delighted to be here today. I've been working with Acas for about 15 years, so I've got a lot of very practical experience about working with employers and their employees and the trade unions. And this agenda is one that's been around for a long time, and it's a great pleasure for me to see something that's actually coming into place that can fill a gap that's been there for a long time, particularly for those small employers. As many of you know, Acas, we might often see what goes wrong in organisations because we're dealing with the tribunal claims and the early conciliation cases and the workplace mediations. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Simply Health and CIPD absence surveys that comes out every year. I think what struck me this year particularly was the second point there, about a third of employers reported an increase in people coming to work who are ill already. And I think part of absence policy is not just about managing the people who are off, it's actually managing the people who are also in work and maybe struggling. And also the situation about creating that environment which will help people remain in work before going off. I think one of the things about the Fit for Work service that we've seen is a resource there that can actually help people understand some of those conditions, actually get a resource there for you as an employer to bring in some information about wellness into your workplaces. I mean, there are other places, the NHS, the Choices website is also very good for that. It also struck me, I came across the Mind survey, which said that 1 in 5 respondents who had phoned in sick because of stress, 93% gave a different reason. That sort of gave a trigger to me, really, and it's like, well, that's telling me two things. It's telling me that there might be an issue around stigma around mental health problems in the workplace. So how are people normalising mental health, or is there still something that people are very afraid to admit to because of potential damage to their careers? And the other thing it occurred to me was that actually this could be this will be tripping over into your short-term absence figures, because if they're not telling you about stress, they'll be telling you about headaches, migraines, backaches, stomach aches, things like that. So conflated within your short-term absence figures may well be some issues relating to stress and well-being that you will not be focusing on because you're actually thinking it's other things. So I thought that was worth highlighting. The other thing was actually 94% of people have policies. But we know in ACAS that having a policy is one thing, and having a policy that people actually use and abide by are two completely different things. I came across a wonderful quote from one of the chairmen down at the Southampton Employment Tribunal that said, "Not having a policy is a cardinal sin, not having a policy and not using it is the real sin there." So it's about using the policy. Are you confident that your policies are actually guiding the behaviours that you actually want within your workplace? Are you reviewing your policies? Are you actually reviewing how it actually works in practice rather than what you think it's doing? Another thing that came up was only 25% of employers actually achieved their absence targets. I think it's one thing about policies in particular, particularly absence policies. People tend to have them, but then nothing seems to happen with them. You might get the information, but then what do you do with it is the next step. Okay. Just wanted to highlight this. I think it sort of came up from David and some of his presentations, really. There are many reasons. People might go off to work with a medical condition, but there are many reasons why people don't come back. And I think there are many reasons why people can actually go off as well. I'm going to highlight that one about difficult relationships, because I think it's people who are in employment, it's people who make workplaces. And having done a lot of work around bullying and harassment and mediations within workplaces, it's certainly the case I've done very few mediations where there haven't been at least some health impacts because of those difficult relationships that have between people. So within your working place culture, it's about thinking about, well, what have we got in place that assist people and support organisational justice? How do we know if we've got bullying going in the workplace? If we know about it, what are we doing about it? What are we doing? Is it effective? It does have those impacts. And is it poor management? So I've been wanting to unpick some of these things and think about the management skills that your employees have. Okay. I've called these sort of attendance factors. And in the middle there is well-being. I think absence policies and an approach to managing absence is just one side of the story. The other side is actually being proactive about well-being. And I invite you to think about, within your organisations, what are you actively doing to promote an environment of wellness, an organisation that supports wellness. You will all be doing things about supporting people who are already off work and coming back into work, but what are you doing about being proactive about ensuring that people continue in good health and are resilient? We know that work has intensified. We know that work pressures are increasing. We know we have an ageing workforce. We know that we've got an explosion of health-related issues related to obesity. We know that these are storing up health issues for us as individuals and our employees. So as an employer, what are you doing about it? Your employees probably spend more time at work than they do outside of work with their families. So it is a place where those preventative actions can take place. So I invite you to think about, what are you doing about health and well-being in a proactive way? What are you doing about employee engagement? Because we know that employees who are well engaged within their organisations, enjoy their job, get a lot of that, psychological and affect from that work, have greater job satisfaction, are healthier and more productive. So what's your strategy around employee engagement? And we also know that those employees who are well managed and organisation of those social relationships are productive and quality social relationships, they are also more healthier and more productive. So it's bringing these factors together, I think, makes a real difference. I can't remember, I always forget the name of the coach of the Great Britain cycling team when they won lots of gold medals. I remember seeing an interview, and his reaction, he was asked the question, so what did you do to make the difference that you've won all these gold medals? And his reaction was, well, actually, it wasn't a difference, it was the accumulation of small changes. And I think when we're looking at this, it's actually accumulation, perhaps, of small changes, looking about your management, how people are managed, how relationships are working out within your organisation. What are we doing around promoting wellness in our organisations, and what are we doing around employee engagement? Because those coming together will make those accumulation of small changes that will make a difference. Okay. Mentioned about having that absence policy. These are some of the things that we would expect to see within a policy, and it's about being clear. It's amazing how many people, when the claims were getting through, didn't really know what the process was, weren't clear about what the procedures were. And then I've also dealt with some HR people who are tearing their hair out because they have very clear processes, they have very clear procedures, but people are not using them. So if people are continually not reporting in, is that a capability or is it a conduct issue? You've got things to use within these. Many people do not actually let people know what it is at induction, well, what it is you do need to do. People need to know what it is they need to do before you can actually start taking action if they don't do it. What are the triggers? Do you set trigger points for having those conversations? Trigger points for going to occupational health or medical reports? I know for some of you may be thinking about, well, we can put a trigger into our policy about referring fit to work. Yes, you can. But remember, it is a voluntary process. Okay, so please do set that trigger. We will refer, if somebody has not been referred at 4 weeks, then we can refer you for that. But you may need other triggers for other things, as for other support as well. Okay. Thinking about policy and practice, I think one of the things that we see often is when people go off sick, it's sort of assumed by the employee and sometimes the employer that the employer cannot contact them. No, you can't contact me, that's harassment. One thing I would sort of suggest is within your policies make it very explicit that yes, you can contact your employees and yes, you will be contacting them and this is the process, but doing it from that place of we're here to support you, we want you to return to work, you are a valued employee and this is how we're going to keep in contact with you. There are a range of options, but we will be keeping in contact with you. And it's also a thing about if you are going to be setting a trigger at that 4 week for referral, you will need to know whether your employee has actually had those conversations with their GP or not. So you need to be keeping in contact with your employee, but make it explicit. But also remember that this is a voluntary service. I know there was a question from another session to say, well, can I make it contractual? Do they have to? Can I make it that they have to, we will be doing it, and by signing the contract, they're giving us their permission. Bit of a two-edged sword. Somebody might sign a contract 10 years ago, and you're doing it, if data protection, is this, do you really have consent for that? Okay. Going back to the policies, if it's in part of your contractual policy, if it is part of your policy, we know that most employers end up in tribunal case not because they don't have a policy, it's because their managers or somebody has not used that policy. So it is a bit of a double-edged sword. I mean, you can, nothing's stopping you. It's your contract of employment. But if you're going to make it contractual, if you don't refer at 4 weeks or 5 weeks, will you be then in breach of contract? I would suggest you keep it as a voluntary thing and just deal with it in the way that you deal with things naturally as you do now. If somebody refuses to cooperate, if somebody refuses to go, you take that into consideration. You base your judgment on the information that you already have, just as you do with any other occupational health referral or request for medical reports. Because they are just part of your guide, they're part of your judgment. They're not the be-all and end-all. But we know that effective management is really important about how people experience work and their relationship to work. If you've got a very poor relationship with your managers, that's going to affect your health and well-being. Okay? And I put that having those difficult conversations, it was mentioned earlier. How many, can I just ask, quick show of hands, how many people actually train their managers in having those difficult conversations around capability or performance and conduct issues? Yeah, about a third. Yeah. I always think sometimes when somebody becomes a manager, part of their kit bag ought to be a tin hat and a magic wand. It'd be much better if it was a tin hat, magic wand and some training that would go in to help managers have those difficult conversations. It's not rocket science, but people do need to have a bit of training to get the confidence to have them. Because if people are nipping things in the bud, having those conversations early, it prevents a lot of problems being stored up later on. And certainly a lot of frustration for the manager. So think about how you're going to enable your managers to have those difficult conversations with people. Can also quick show of hands. How many people collect absence data? Virtually everybody. Fantastic. How many do anything with it? Yeah, a few less. How many of you actually cost it out? Fewer still. And I think that's an important step, particularly when we're thinking about creating an environment of wellness, one that supports well-being. Because the cost of your absence, the cost of sickness absence, is actually going into the cost of your product or services. Okay, it's a part of it being of a competitive edge, but it's also a part of, well, this is what it's costing you, and we know it's costing. One organisation I worked with, long-term stress was costing £350,000 a year, which is a lot of money. Okay. So what they did was take a proportion of that and actually invested in doing front loading. Okay, what can we do to prevent that happening in the first place? So they did a bit of a spend to save, and put into place some initiatives that actually reduced that by some education and also some support services that went in. I think there's Centrica put in back clinics, and for every pound they spent, they saved £32. The evidence is there about how preventative action can save money in wellness. So if you're needing to make a business case to your financial controller, cost out what absence is actually costing you, and then use that to think ahead, and that's spend to save. Okay. Acas best practice, that's us. So we want to think about line management, involvement and competence. I can't stress, I think we've sort of said before how important this is. But I think it's also worth noting that in a lot of the stress surveys that have been going around, actually the line managers themselves are also the ones who are experiencing an awful lot of stress at the moment. Their expectations are quite high. So as an employer, what support are you giving your line managers? Are you just supplying them with a tin hat and a magic wand? Or are you actually doing things to help support them in their practice and improve their practice and improve how they're managing things? Because a well-managed organisation is also a healthier organisation. It's also a much more productive organisation, but is a healthier organisation. And again, the evidence is there time and time again. I've talked about policies and talked about the trigger mechanisms and those return to work interviews. How many people do those return to work interviews? Again, a large proportion. Certainly with the CIPD surveys that have happened, and our experience through Acas is that they are one of the most effective methods of managing absence within the workplace. But again, it's the quality of those return to work interviews. Has it just become a tick box exercise, or are those managers actually do have the skills and the confidence to have quality return to work interviews? Are they actually doing what you want them to do, or are they just part and parcel of okay, that's just what we do, right, that's done that, tick that box and gone off and forget it? If it's just the tick box exercise, is it worth doing? Is it just a bureaucratic administrative expense? If they're not, if they're quality, they do have an impact. We've also seen that changing of working patterns and practices has become very important within the workplace for managing return to work and managing particularly health conditions in the workplace. And I recognise that for a lot of employers, this is becoming a bit, the flexibility can be a bit difficult. Because if you've already got half your team off with flexible working patterns, what do you do with the next one that comes along? Can I just sort of think, can you just ask, how many people actually review their flexible working patterns for those people that have actually had it? Because I know within my own organisation, we've had people that become part-time working for childcare issues, but their children now married and got, grandchildren, they've got children of their own, but it's never been reviewed. And, we're just like any other organisation, and we're now starting to review, well, what is this happening? Because it is much more a requirement now to have those flexible working arrangements. And as we become older, and a lot of us now that squeeze generation where we have elders to care for and we have youngsters to care for, actually having that flexibility to be able to alter our patterns of work is actually becoming much more important, to be able to manage the things that impact on our well-being. And that access to support, the counselling, the mediation services, the Fit for Work. Make sure your employees know about it and they are there, and the access is facilitated, put it that way. Again, work for a lot of organisations where they have employee assistance programmes, and we've been telling people about this for 15 years and we still don't know about it. What more can we do? I think it's just carrying on, plugging on, isn't it? But having the support to enable people to return successfully to work or not go off in the first place is actually very important. Sure, it's better to try and tackle somebody's musculoskeletal problems before they go, before it becomes a problem, rather than after. I put this one in, partly because I think we were talking about stress earlier, and it is now the most common cause of days lost in the workplace. When I talk to employers, I find often that employers have got lots of screening and do lots of things around workstations, IT, manual handling, noise, things like that. But when I ask them, well, what are you doing about mental health? How are you assessing the risks of people's mental health in your workplace? And there's often a bit of a deafening silence. And I think, given the intensity of work, given the changes in our lives and the work and the things that are happening with people in the workplace, this is an issue where we have to start thinking much more creatively and actually start doing more about, okay, how do we protect, how do we maintain, how do we build resilience? What are we doing around people's mental health in the workplace? Okay. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the HSE stress management standards. They've been around a long time, but I'm still surprised how many employers don't know about it and don't use them. Or they might use them once in a blue moon, not quite like the results they get, and think, oh my God, I'm never doing that again. It is one of the few tools that is sort of widely acknowledged and widely known about, that will give you an insight into some of that mental health, particularly around stress. We know that these are the factors, if handled well, will help prevent stress within the workplace, and if they're not handled well, will contribute to them. What I often see is also these being used at an organisational level, but not so much as a proactive tool that people are using with individuals in their within their workplace. People returning to work. If somebody's returning to work from stress, are these being looked at? I imagine from the Fit for Work service, this will become part of a return to work plan, particularly if people have gone with workplace for stress. But you also need to be thinking a bit more proactively about, what do we do? Do we have hotspots within our organisation? How can we use these to actually prevent stress within the workplace? How many of you have come across this other piece of work that was done by CIPD and HSE? It was a follow-on from the stress competencies. There were roadshows a couple of years ago, and these are the behaviours that we know that if people, if managers, these are the factors which can also prevent stress within the workplace, because we know that management style is also one of those areas that can cause people difficulties within the workplace. I'm sure HR people amongst you, it's how people have had many grievances about, well, it's the way I'm managed, or the way they do this, or the way they do that. This again is a free download. It's an audit tool. It's available on the HSE website. It's free of charge. And these are the behaviours, those management behaviours, which we know to be encouraged to help prevent stress in the workplace. I don't think there's anything there that you could disagree with, really. Looks like good management practice. Okay? What I suggest you do is use it as a learning and development tool. Use it as part of your management development programs. Are you training your managers to manage well-being as well as manage absence? Are you training your managers to help prevent stress in the workplace, or are you training them just how to react when it's already happened? Okay, so this is about that prevention side. Okay. I'm going to talk about, we're Acas, so we'll be talking about discipline and grievance, but organisational justice is actually, has a huge impact on people's well-being and how that is handled within the organisation. Okay? Having those effective discipline and grievance procedures. And I'm sure amongst you here must be many of those employers where somebody's up for a disciplinary and suddenly they go off sick. Yeah? Or, somebody's had a grievance and it's not been responded to well, and it's ended up with a health problem or a capability issue. Okay? So again, training your managers in how to actually manage discipline and grievance is one of the fundamental building blocks, I think, for effective, for a healthy workplace. Acas have just recently published a report around bullying in the workplace, and we've seen a rise in bullying. Our helpline last year took over 20,000 calls from people who had reported being bullied in the workplace. I took an interest in bullying and harassment when I first joined Acas 15 years ago, and I was doing perhaps sort of advisory sessions once every month. I could now be doing them more or less every day of the week. People are actually much more aware of the impact of bullying upon their health and well-being, and employers have become much more aware of the impact of those behaviours on the wider team and the wider productivity. So again, if you've not put into place things that's going to pick up that, please do so. In my experience, most people will not report bullying in a formal way. They will leave, or they will find an informal way of doing it. So again, thinking in a much more strategic way, how would we know that we had a problem within our workplace? What are we doing about it? And also, we're also seeing a rise in whistleblowing used as a way of raising these issues. So organisational justice is pretty fundamental. Moving on to employee engagement, I'm sure you're all fairly familiar with this, with these sort of figures, that those employees that report high engagement levels actually become healthier, more productive than those with lower engagement levels. So again, I'll challenge you to start thinking about, okay, is employee engagement something that just happens within our organisation, or is it something that we're actually involved in promoting and thinking about? The work that David McLeod did in Engaging for Success, which identified the drivers for employee engagement, will be recognised across good management practice. Employee voice obviously is one which for Acas is very important. How people are involved in the decisions that are made about them in the workplace. How can they? How is their concerns and their ideas and creativity captured in order to improve the workplace? Good management, leadership, just good, solid employment relations issues. Okay. Acas also, for those of you who don't know, Acas have a lot of resources which can help with some of these issues. We do a lot of training. We can come out and train with you, but for a lot of organisations that may not be suitable or a bit prohibitive. So most of the things we also have are e-learning packages. For me, it's horses for courses. I prefer to actually go and listen to somebody and engage with people and talk to people about issues. For some people, e-learning is absolutely fine and fantastic. Those e-learning resources are free, they're free downloads, and we have had lots of organisations have them on their own websites. We can arrange that. There's a method for doing that. And we've got the research paper on bullying, and we also have our mediation services, which can help. Other people also have mediation services, which I need to point out. But one thing I think was quite important, I thought was actually a really good piece of work done with CRUISE, the charity for bereavement. I think this is an issue which is really not really talked about very much in the workplace. And sometimes it does underline some of those health issues when people are going off, particularly if people have gone off for a bereavement reason, but then are finding difficulty coming back. And I'm sure the Fit for Work will be picking up on some of these issues as well. When we ran the workshops around this, there was a huge divergence of practice within organisations about how bereavement is managed within the workplace. So we've put together a guide with crews around bereavement care. It happens in our workplaces all the time, but we tend not to really think about it in a sort of structured way. That's been our experience of sort of running the workshops. So it's a new piece of guidance that has come out. So again, it's a free download on the website, so please do look at it. And I think when you're looking at the Fit for Work and Return to Work plans, I think where there has been, people have got stuck in that grieving process. Obviously, there are other sources of help for people to help move through that. So just as a bit of a Blue Peter slide at the end, thinking about managing absence and managing wellness, because for me it is two sides, it's part of a balance. You can manage absence, but you also need to manage well-being within the workplace. In some ways, managing absence is easier because you know where they are. It's actually managing the struggling and the present and the difficulties within the workplace is actually sometimes a bit more difficult. So here are some of those ones that sort of we recognise as actually having an impact on people's well-being. I'm sure playing to people's strengths, being in the wrong job can be a real struggle. That can have a real impact on people's capacity to cope with what they're doing. Knowing your staff, knowing what those early signs are. Is this normal behaviour for this particular person? If it's not, there should be some alarm bells ringing. Is it an issue with stress, or is there an issue with interpersonal relationships with that person? And I love the part of the evidence for the employee engagement survey, the employee engagement staff was, when somebody's doing really badly, what I do is sit down and give them a good listening to. And we know from talking for employees that those managers that do listen and actively listen can make a huge amount of difference. Sometimes that's all that's needed is actually what I've been listened to, and that helps. And I would do a little one there about taking breaks. Okay, how many of you work through your lunch break? Yeah, don't do as I do as I say. Yeah. But again, it is very important for productivity and also people's well-being to actually ensure that people have their lunches. I think I've talked about most of those other things. And managing that performance in that fair and consistent way. All these things, again, it's sort of about making those little changes, and sometimes these little changes that you can make sort of add up to a bigger change that will be noticed and seen reflected in the productivity of your organisation and the overall wellness of your organisation. Okay. Those are my contact details, so if I've sort of said anything you think, I want to go back to her about that, what does she mean by that, please do drop me an email or give me a ring. And if there's any of the services that you think, I'm not too sure about that, again, please do get in contact with me. What we can see from the Fit for Work service, I think it is now creating that linkage really between the signposting, the additional services and support that people may need to return to work successfully. What they need to return to is an organisation that supports their well-being. It's no good having an all singing, all dancing return to work plan if 6 months later they're back to the beginning because it's not been handled well in the workplace. That's my plea. That's it. Thank you.